Hello, and welcome to the Natural State Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin. It is my belief that the natural state of any living organism is health, and that our artificial habitat has forced us into having artificial health problems. This show is my attempt to dive deep and learn about using nutrition, sleep, movement, relationships, and more to help you reclaim your natural state of health in a modern world and show you how to thrive in an environment that's stacked against you. If you enjoyed today's show, you can find out more details and information at dranthonygustin.com. Joining me on the podcast today is Rafi Sertoli. Rafi is a super bright guy who is very educated in a PhD program right now, already got his master's in molecular biology, and he is also the founder of an app called Nutrita. And Nutrita is a phenomenal source where it's not like a lot of other tracking apps like MyFitnessPal, etc. They actually do a lot of different things that are interesting. So for each food, they give it a nutrition score, a keto score, and an insulin score. So if you're looking to sort of fix your metabolism and also increase nutrition, I don't think there's any better app for you. It's phenomenal. And so we sort of talk about his background, his experience with keto, and his research. And then we dive in deep into his app and how he's sort of come to the thought process and all the data behind coming with an insulin score, a keto score, and a nutrition score, and why you should not be worrying about calories. So super smart guy, great conversation, and I hope you guys take a lot out of it. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to tell you about how you can directly support the show. It is not free to produce this podcast, and I don't want to use the typical model of selling your attention to sponsors to fund the show. I want you to be able to take all of my health recommendations seriously without wondering if I'm being paid to promote something to you. If you want to support the team that is behind this podcast, head on over to either one of the brands that I've founded at perfectketo.com or equipfoods.com. I've developed the products for each of these companies with my insanely high standards because I couldn't find them anywhere else. Perfect Keto offers everything you need to support a whole foods-based ketogenic diet, from exogenous ketones to help you transition into keto and boost your energy, to super clean collagen bars that have been tested not to spike your blood sugar. It's literally the only bar that I know of that won't, and that's why I made it. Over at Equip Foods, we take real food ingredients seriously. You'll find only whole food ingredients like beef protein powder, sweet potato powder, grass-fed liver capsules, and more. If it's your first time trying the products at either one of these brands, use code NATURALSTATE for 20% off your first order. And if you feel amazing focusing on 100% real foods, awesome. These products are intended to support a proper foundation of health and nutrition, and they're not magic pills. All right, enough of that. Let's get into the show. Rafi, thanks for being on the show, my man.
Hi, Anthony. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, of course. So a lot of the team members at Perfect Keto and some of my friends also use your app that you made, which I would love to get into and chat about this. But it's just, I think, one of the best tools available to look at nutrition and sort of cater it in a personalized level, which I don't think any app does a good job of. So I'd love to get into that and your work there. But before we begin, I'd just like to chat about, you sort of have an interesting education background. So we dive in a little bit there. What is your education training and sort of how did you get started there?
Yeah, so I've had a bit of a circuitous path to get to my PhD in health sciences that I'm currently doing. Specifically, I'm sort of combining neuroscience, metabolism, and some behavioral stuff to try to understand the effect of antipsychotics on rats that are made sort of modeled to be schizophrenic. And I'm looking at their behavior, like the anatomy of their brain, what it does to certain brain cells, and trying to understand basically to see if, ketogenic diets can mitigate some of the side effects from antipsychotics. So, were you into keto before that, or was it something that you sort of picked up along the way, learning sort of what therapeutic agents it could be used for? Yeah, so I was doing a ketogenic diet long before my PhD. It was sort of a bit random that I could fit in a ketogenic diet into my PhD question, because I was just doing it to better understand the metabolism effects of schizophrenia. And basically, it led me to think that, okay, maybe the ketogenic diet could actually mitigate some of the effect of the antipsychotics. So that's sort of how I fit it in. But I personally tried the ketogenic diet for a couple of years before that, and now have ended up on this carnivore eating pattern.
Oh, interesting. I'd love to chat about nutrient density as in regards to carnivore diet moving forward. But yeah, so that was sort of your foundation, or sort of where did you start going down this path of just health? Like what motivated you to be diving in so deep here?
I actually started university when I was 17 years old in London, and I started a business course, and I just found it really, really boring, to be honest. So I thought, okay, I have to change into something more interesting. And I was getting back into science and started sort of experimenting with dietary changes after reading Gary Taubes' book. And from then on, basically, it led me into my master's in molecular biology, where I did my thesis on the metabolic theory of cancer and specifically looked at breast cancer cells and how they respond to molecules that inhibit certain pathways, metabolic pathways. And this can sort of give us hints as to how the cancer cell is behaving and if indeed it's able to use glucose or fats or ketones and how it's consuming oxygen. And it sort of helps us trying to falsify the idea that so that cancer cells can breathe normally, respire normally. And that's really important if you're trying to have a theory of cancer that's actually going to make predictions that pan out. So that's how I got into molecular biology. And from there, really, I just wanted to keep gaining some lab experience because I had a lot of, we could say, armchair research, many years of armchair research behind me, and sort of wanted to gain some credibility by doing some actual lab work. So now I worked with mice, I worked with rats, I worked with cells. I did some behavioral stuff, as I mentioned before, trying to see how rats behave, how their memory is affected by antipsychotics, and basically just trying to get a better picture of metabolism and health in different models and trying to apply that, in the app and in my own life, actually. So this is a pretty broad topic, personally and professionally.
Did your research lead you to any sort of path-dependent outcomes, or was it sort of like, okay, I've been eating like this anyways, read some Gary Taubes, sort of like on the track of, I'm sure, lower carb? What were some of the shifts from the research that you had done that led you where you are now?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's hard to tell sometimes why you've, taken a certain decision. Did you already decide it before and then you justified it later, or how did that actually go? I think in my case, the most convincing arguments were initially laid out by Gary Taubes. I think his historical take is super, super important because it's really lacking amongst researchers and doctors. When we forget our past and how we came to believe certain things in science and medicine, we're just going to repeat the same mistakes again and again. And so I think what Gary Taubes did is a massive service for nutrition research generally. And whether or not you can truly blame sugar for 80% or more of the modern ills remains to be seen. But I think the basic thesis is super important. So that definitely had a big influence on me and basically led me to eliminate sugar and flour from my diet. The seed oil sort of came later. I sort of understood that by speaking with Tucker and George Henderson and some other people who really, sort of illuminated that aspect of health for me. And once I got those three things down, where you can avoid basically all junk food if you avoid sugar, flour, and seed oils. I mean, that's really most of what junk food is. And if you do that, well, it matters much less if you're carnivore, if you're omnivore, if you're keto, if you're low carb. Those are sort of more specific and just tailored to the person. But the general health principle, I think, holds. If you eliminate those three things, you've done more than 80% of the work. Yeah,
I mean, I've sort of have taken the position recently that eliminating vegetable oils and seed oils is probably one of the biggest things, if not the number one thing, just because, these rancid fats get stored in your cell membranes for, up to 2 years. Whereas you eat sugar once, it can, wreak havoc from a metabolic standpoint. If you do it long enough over a long period of time, obviously, you have obesity, diabetes, these type of things, chronic disease coming from it. But when you eat something and it stays with you for 2 years, and it's sort of this hidden thing that nobody really knows about. People know that sugar is not good for you and they can taste it. There's a feedback mechanism of something being sweet. And that's why I think that it's sort of sneaky how much vegetable oil people can consume and not realize it. There's no feedback mechanism. There's no taste. There's no, anything like sugar where it can tell you, yet it stays with you for a really long time. So I think that it's sort of a more of a hidden problem than people realize.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I was talking about the fact that I am changing my mind, actually. I was talking about that with a friend that seed oils may be way more pernicious than we initially thought. And it's sort of interesting to see how much you can explain with sugar versus seed oils. And I think there's a really, really strong case for seed oils to be, at the heart of a lot of inflammatory bowel conditions. I think there's a really good case for that. It certainly seems very, very important in cancer. I mean, you can't even induce cancer if you don't have enough linoleic acid in the diet. So, that should really, I think, lead us to understand that, a lot of the cell culture work and the work in mice that started in cancer, like it's really easy to induce cancer now and to cure it in animal models, but that wasn't always the case. And we sort of figured out that, linoleic acid is really important for that. It could be because it affects the cardiolipin, these very sensitive molecules in mitochondria. It could be because of the inflammatory insult, the generalized inflammatory insult that leads to basically damaged mitochondria from a lot of the cytokines and all of that stuff. It's not clear, but what seems to be clear is that it's really important to initiate cancer.
Yeah. So, I mean, what amounts are we talking about here? And is it like what models are you looking at?
I think it was around 4% linoleic acid,
which is actually when compared to an average American diet, at least the average Western diet. I mean, majority of people are eating far more than that.
Oh yeah, it's in the double digits,
yeah.
And this is the thing. Linoleic acid or this omega-6 fatty acid.
Yeah, why don't we just actually stop for a second for people who don't know what this means, and just break down linoleic acid for some clarity.
Yeah, so linoleic acid is the sort of unstable, non-saturated, so highly unsaturated fat that you're going to find in a lot of seeds. For example, you're going to find it in soy. You're going to find it in grains, and you can extract that fat. So you have the omega-3s and the omega-6. So the main omega-6 is linoleic acid, and you can extract that fat with sort of heavy industrial machinery. So we've only been able to do that for the past couple hundred years or something. And this is the element that before we would have consumed in micronutrient amounts that we are now consuming in macronutrient amounts. And that's sort of a big deal from the perspective of, dietary change. So I think it's sort of interesting that something that we could handle in smaller amounts, now we're having to handle in much higher amounts, and we're sort of not, let's say mainstream medicine is not necessarily aware of that big change.
Yeah. And I think that's, again, like what are normal physiological amounts we could consume before? So, this is just polyunsaturated fats are not, like, you don't want to reduce them to absolutely zero. And some of these things do exist in natural foods in certain amounts, but the amount we can consume by eating things like seed oils, like you shouldn't be able to consume several thousand seeds that are highly processed to get the certain fat out of them. Like you don't consume that all in isolation. It's just something that doesn't exist in nature to be able to acquire all of that fat in one way. There's just limiting effects. So if you try to get the same thing from, let's say, an animal product, you would have to eat, I haven't done the calculation, but I'm assuming thousands of pounds to get the same amount as a cup of vegetable oil or seed oil. And I think this is the problem here that, you're talking about the mechanism. We're not really sure exactly if it's this pathway or that pathway. And I think with a lot of these things, people get a little bit hung up on the mechanisms and, if you can't explain why, then I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to avoid it. But you just look for the fundamental state of, like, is this a normal part of a human environment and what an animal should be eating? And the answer is no. Then I think that it's not a surprise that these mechanisms are popping up to me and that these things are tied together when we're eating something that's just completely artificial to our environment. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. And it's one of the things where I kind of make it a priority. I'm fine if I have some carbs here and there, even some flour. I don't get any immediate effects. I don't have a terrible gluten sensitivity or anything. But seed oils, man, it messes with me fast.
What do you experience?
So basically digestive issues. So anything from inflammation to diarrhea to sort of malaise. Just you can feel that you're inflamed. It's quite palpable. I think everybody probably has one or two things they can get that bad feeling from. In my case, it's clearly seed oils.
Yeah, I think that people in general also, sort of the analogy that I like to use is that they're driving around with a windshield that has never been cleaned before. So it has dirt, bugs, everything blasted all over it. And I think that when you finally clean it up, and get your diet, nutrition, exercise, sleep, all this stuff under control, you wipe that windshield clean for the first time. So then when you're driving down the road and a giant bug hits your windshield, you go, oh shit, like what, like I need to clean that now, it's dirty. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, they're having so much background information all the time that they don't get when some of these things crop up and don't feel any feedback. With me, for instance, with vegetable oils, who have super clean diet, otherwise in lifestyle, that it's like you said, the malaise, I will for the rest of the day sort of have this like brain fog, lack of clarity, low energy, and then into the next morning as well. I wake up and I just feel like I had drank a couple glasses of wine or something like that, just from having vegetable oils. And it doesn't even have to be that much. And so I think that when you start getting things dialed in, and at a point where you can see these things happening to you, then you can start noticing, but the feedback loop is still not really tight and clear. It's not, it's not like you're eating something and you're instantly changing your experience. And I think that this is obviously could be another podcast, but I think people just in general suppress how they feel emotionally, suppress how they feel physically, and just sort of are all in their head all the time and not even in tune with their body at all. So, I mean, that makes it a sort of a super challenging thing, of course.
Yeah. And it's funny. People will literally tell me, but if I start eating clean, isn't it going to be really annoying when I start eating dirty again? And so I tell them, well, maybe, but it's sort of what other choice do you have?
Yeah, but I mean, yeah. Of course, you'll notice that you feel like crap again. But do you want to choose that, or do you want to just continue to feel good? I mean, this is the thing that is always confusing to me too. Of people when they say, "Oh, like I can't go on this sort of nutrition plan because I eat rice and beans all the time, and I could never give that up." But yet they're complaining about feeling sick and low energy and all these other things. And I think that to a certain point, you sort of need to make sure that your value system and your priorities are straight and aligned. And that way you say, oh, okay, like I prioritize feeling good and having a new experience as a human over having this transient mouth pleasure, which is like, I am no stickler on this stuff. Like I was talking to you earlier before we got on the show, like when I go to France, I'm going to have some pastries and things like that. And I eat locally and so I indulge whenever I want to, but I just don't make it a part of my life. And I understand that, there's trade-offs to the things you eat and consume in other lifestyle things as well. If I stay up late, super late one night and don't get a lot of sleep because I'm hanging out with friends, like I just know that the next day is not going to be as productive per se. Mm-hmm. But I'm prioritizing certain things at certain times. And I think that a lot of people just don't have a really clear value set as far as their life and how they want to live it. And so it makes it really challenging to make, I would say a huge bounty of nutrition choices throughout a day.
Yeah, it's the behavior change question is something I've had to really think about pretty hard in the past 2 years when we started building the app. And I think, like you say, when you don't have the right value set, it's basically like trying to navigate without a compass. You don't know why you're doing things. You don't know where you can indulge and where you can't. You don't really have the information. You don't have the good feedback. The tangible feedback from your body because too much stuff is going wrong. So there's no good signal to noise ratio. So you sort of have to take a lot of the crap away and start reintroducing something based on a sound principle, like the one we mentioned before, where you eliminate the elements that are in the junk food triad, flour, sugar, and seed oils. And you don't necessarily need to get much more specific than that. But for behavior change, I think some sound basic principles is really important.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that just taking it back to you guys' app, I think there's something that's really unique is that you sort of center around, I think, what was it, 4 different things as far as you sort of make it so that people have to choose a priority. And you can't say, do you want to lose fat and gain muscle and control your blood sugar and eat healthy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's what everybody likes to think at first. And it's so much easier to have a clear path of where you want to go if you choose a destination. It's like if I get in my car, I'm trying to drive across town, my fiance's in the car and we're like, okay, where are we going to go eat? It's like, well, we could eat here, 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 here. Let's, it's like, you can't go to all destinations. If you pick one and your GPS can tell you, okay, turn here, drive this way, go that way. And I think that people don't think that way about their own health and prioritizing certain things at certain times. And that it's okay to, if you want to transiently focus on losing fat or controlling your metabolism or whatever, that's okay to work on one goal at a time and have more specificity because you'll get there faster.
Yeah. And I think something that should hopefully be more encouraging to people is that whichever goal you choose, you should have general improvements in addition to the specific improvement. I think that's key when we try to understand what to expect when we're getting better. I think sometimes because people are sort of taught to think in this very sort of classical medical system where you think of different parts of the body and that's it.
Right.
But if we're trying to control your blood sugar, what we're doing is we're changing the insulin sensitivity of your adipose tissue. We're changing your triglycerides. We're changing tons of different stuff, and all of that as a very general impact. So it's fine to choose a specific goal, but I think you should also judge the efficacy of the advice you're given by how it's affecting the rest of your health, because the rest should get better as well. You shouldn't really have too many things going in opposite directions.
Yeah, when you make positive choices, it's almost like having positive side effects. Whereas you may have one primary goal, but you're going to have a lot of these adjacent results regardless.
Yeah, and it sort of gets back to what you were discussing with Travis Christofferson in a recent podcast, where a lot of the cancer therapies we're giving people have these terrible, terrible side effects, and they're not necessarily that healthier after having survived the therapy and the cancer. And this is sort of to use an overused expression, a paradigm shift in medicine that needs to happen, where we expect the immune system to be protected from the cancer therapy because it's actually essential to beating the cancer up. So I think it's really shifting your expectations and sort of your framework for assessing, is something actually working? Is this evidence-based? Is this based in empirical fact, at least for my N of 1?
Right. And so you obviously co-founded this app, and I'm not surprised at the quality in the focus on nutrition, just because you're obviously an educated guy and you're super sharp. But I mean, what got you down the path of focusing so much on nutrient density and not just macros or helping people lose fat, et cetera?
Yeah, the focus on nutrient density and the things that really distinguish us from the perspective of our advice is that if you choose a fat loss goal with us, we're not going to give you a very specific calorie goal. We just don't trust the estimations that you can do by giving your body weight and your basic parameters.
Yeah, I did an RMR recently. And based upon whatever calculation, it was saying that something like, at maintenance, I should eat, 2,000 calories. My RMR was, I think, 3,400.
Well, yeah, 2,000, that's ridiculous. I mean, what kind of, that's a terrible estimate.
Right. And this is
obviously like an athletic guy.
Even if it was off by 700 calories, I think that would be a giant mismatch between somebody who wants to either put on muscle mass or lose fat. And, then we get people who are going off these estimates and then reducing off of that and then eating 1,200 calories a day when they actually have a need of 3,000 and just trashing their metabolisms. Yeah,
I mean, this is why so many of the sort of food tracking apps are, I mean, just to put it bluntly, they're basically garbage. And I think a lot of them don't know it. I think they're actually trying to give what they think is an accurate estimate. But it just doesn't work that way. It's not even in the hundreds of calories, because getting fat is about the mass of your adipose tissue, really. As a disease, it's not a disease of too many calories. It's a problem of overgrowing fat mass that's not controlled, right? That has sort of wacky mTOR and insulin signaling and just gets way too big and sucks up calories. Sucks up, fats and stuff like that from the bloodstream and just grows way too big. And you don't need a 800, kilocalorie surplus to do that. What you need is just, I think if you do the calculation, and you can check this out in some of the lectures by Gary Taubes and some very old papers, that you just need to, quote, overeat by, the bite of an apple a day for a decade to start gaining, a couple, pounds and pounds of fat, right, like a lot of people do. So it's actually the level of accuracy that you would be required to control your, assuming it's even possible, but your body fat mass by controlling your calories, it's just not possible. So our app doesn't tell you to hit a specific target. We give you an estimate, as the best estimate we can do, because that's what you need when you calculate your macros, which are actually going to be a more useful lever to actually change your fat mass. Right. And then we go another layer deep, and we say, okay, what is your carb limit and your protein target? Because that you can be accurate. And that is actually going to, affect your satiety, your satiation. It's going to affect your, your insulin levels. So those are the things we want to focus on, because we're not going to pretend we're going to give you advice that's accurate to 20 kilocalories. We prefer to give you advice that's accurate to, 5 to 10 grams of protein and carbs that you can easily learn to calculate.
Right. And so, I mean, as far as that goes, I mean, you guys, like I said before, have sort of different tracks you put people on. Is this something that you've learned in the past where people, if they have different goals, their nutrition and macros are going to differ, or, both of those things? Like, how are you looking at this as far as, if your goal is A, B, C, or D, your nutrition and or your macros are going to change by, X, Y, Z?
Yeah, so for fat loss and blood sugar control, we tend to have some pretty ketogenic macros. We think that's sort of the set of advice that's going to cover most people and get them most of the results. So that's for carbs, for example, in those two goals. But for the protein, it's going to be around 1.8 to even up to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein a day. If you're trying to gain muscle or losing fat, we tend to keep the protein on the high side. So we've got some higher protein recommendations for people trying to put on muscle mass, and they're slightly lower for the other goals, but they're pretty high compared to the average, because one interesting thing that you get when you don't sort of restrict protein like maybe a vegetarian might suggest, you sort of get a lot of more nutrition as well. So it's sort of a double win to try to keep the protein relatively high. So, I just gave out some numbers like 1.8 gram per kilogram. And people don't have to worry about knowing exactly how much that is, because we give them the food equivalence in the app, which tells you it's about, a half a pound of meat plus a couple of eggs or whatever.
Right.
So people don't have to go
way more useful than people trying to measure stuff out.
Yeah, I can never remember the figures myself, so I just, it's just way easier to look at it like that. And yeah, we tend to be we're definitely low carb for all of the advice that we give. Not because we don't think you can't be healthy on a higher carb diet, simply that it's more complicated. So we're trying to keep things pretty simple, and I would say we have the belief that pretty much everyone can do well on different degrees of carb restriction. And we also have, a slider for the carbs and the protein, allowing to people to, pull them up or pull them down according to how they feel, because maybe the app is going to recommend something that's good but not perfect. And with a bit of experimentation, you can adjust it yourself. So I think it's important that people have that freedom to adjust their goals. The app is not omniscient, but so we try to give you a good starting point and then let you play around with it a bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, as far as carbohydrate intake, I mean, what are some of the things, like you said, it's harder to dial in? What is your opinion on that?
For the carbohydrate intake, what we recommend?
Yeah. As far as just sort of doing a blanket low carb approach.
Mm-hmm. So if people have never been in ketosis, which is the case for a lot of people who come to the app, they'll get a carbohydrate recommendation that's usually under 50 grams or 70 grams.
Got it.
And that will sort of put them on the edge of ketosis, where depending on how many times they eat a day and when they eat and all of that, it's going to get them sort of fat adapted, and they will show varying levels of ketosis. So we have people showing, just posting their pictures of their macros and their ketone levels. And it's interesting. Some people, do get ketones around, I would say, 0.4 with about 50 grams of carbs, and others get it up to 1.5. So you've got a substantial variation, but it's sort of this low-level ketogenesis. And we don't even necessarily care about your ketone levels. We're more interested in the fact that it's a good signal that your insulin is low.
Got it. Okay.
And that for us is super important.
And so your thought process is that, just generally speaking, if somebody's signing up for your application, they need help changing over the metabolism so it's a little bit more flexible and can burn fat if it needs to, or carbohydrates. Because if that's the case, then I totally agree that this is a good approach.
Yeah, we keep so we have a keto score, an insulin score, and a nutrient density score. So this helps people choose their foods. If they're following a ketogenic diet, they can use the keto score. if they're maybe overweight or diabetic, they're going to keep an eye on the insulin score, because a lot of, they'll have read our article saying that it's important to keep insulin low to reverse these conditions. So we sort of try to give them a metric that's not calories, because calories matter, but they're useless when it comes to behavior change. So we think that if people try to hit the simple goal of, okay, I ate my protein, I kept my carbs low, and my nutrient density score is pretty good, like that's so much better than what the average person is doing, that I don't care how wrong our calorie estimate is, to be perfectly honest. Like, it's just not practical to focus on that.
Yeah.
So
like the body will take care of itself essentially and get to a sort of a normal equilibrium point by eating this way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's important for people to realize that, yes, people get results when they purposely restrict calories for fat loss, or if they're bodybuilding or something. But that doesn't mean that they targeted a number and then that they hit that number and that's the reason why everything worked. It's just that when you restrict calories, a lot of things are changing. Changes in 3 of the macronutrients or micronutrient levels, tons of different things are changing. So I think it's important for people to realize that, yeah, restriction can lead to fat loss. It's true. But the reason why it works actually matters, because that's what's going to tell us what's sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what is the keto score, the insulin score, the nutrient density score? Like, how do you guys determine each one of those?
So basically, we're looking through the scientific literature with my co-founder, and I was telling him about this insulin index that I knew about, and he was like, "Well, couldn't people use that to choose foods that don't jack up their insulin?" I was like, "Yeah, it's probably a good guide, and could be helpful." And then so we started thinking, yeah, it would probably be a better metric for behavior change than calories or exercise targets, based on calories.
Yeah, I mean, so just maybe an explanation for people about the insulin index.
Yeah, so the insulin index is basically derived from humans being given portions of food and having their insulin measured over 2 hours to be able to say, this food compared to this other food is more or less insulinogenic, meaning it makes you produce more or less of the hormone insulin, which is what your body uses to get amino acids into cells, so the building blocks of cells, to get blood sugar into cells, to store fat, to do all sorts of things, basically. And so this index is based on healthy volunteers. And basically with that, we can tell you that, for example, to give a very simple example, olive oil is not insulinogenic at all, and white bread is super insulinogenic, and it's on, from 0 to 100. So that's what the insulin index is. And the thing that people need to keep in mind when they're using it is that they want to keep a relatively low dietary insulin load over the day, meaning that for the amount of carbs and protein and fat they consumed, they didn't have to use a ton of insulin. Basically, it's a good sign that their metabolism is pretty efficient.
And how much have you seen the difference between a blood glucose reading and an insulin reading?
Yeah, so we were super interested in getting some clinical data to validate that. So we've been pinging up doctors to try to write up some patient like fasting insulin values and have them track their insulin load with our app. So we don't have specific data for you yet, unfortunately, but we're trying to collect it. So any doctors out there who want to participate, please just email me, and I'll be more than happy to look at the correlation.
Right. So, So for instance, I'm wearing a CGM right now and looking at a lot of different foods that I'm eating, and I was just curious if you've seen any data that has shown that even if you keep your blood glucose low, you're still spiking insulin to some degree.
Yeah, so for so you're really lucky to have the CGM. I need to get myself one of those and actually see how it correlates with my diet being tracked in the app. But the thing is, so you basically have 2 choices. You can either use the glycemic index, which is what we've traditionally used to try to predict how the food is going to affect your blood sugar response. Mm-hmm. But I think we now know that sort of it's not that accurate. I mean, it's directionally accurate, but the figures aren't really super helpful. And you get a lot of false positives, meaning that you could eat a food, measure it on your, take your blood sugar, see that it's pretty low, and you're like, oh, okay, like good, that's cool. But what you might not realize is that in order to keep that blood sugar low, you're producing a ton of insulin. And until we get an insulin meter, we're not going to be able to confirm that directly. So that's also why we've been trying to work with some friends of mine in the Netherlands who have a handheld insulin measuring device that just hit the market, and that's able to read insulin with the camera phone. So you prick your finger, have a drop of blood, and the camera phone is supposed to be able to read off, I think, the spectral emission from the insulin molecule in the blood.
Wow,
so
that's
hopefully
ridiculous.
so hopefully that's going to sort of scale up. At the moment, it's pretty expensive and sort of have to ask to get the prototype. But hopefully we'll be able to validate all of these things with a better accuracy. But yeah, at the moment, unfortunately, we have to rely on the insulin score, the glycemic index, or CGM is great, obviously, because you can see the variability, which might be even more important than the average level.
Yeah, and I mean, I've seen the same with friends of mine too, who we all sort of geek out on this stuff. And if I eat, an apple, somebody else eats an apple, a completely different response, completely different. And that's where I think that, again, just personalizing stuff and having feedback and getting more information about your body. Obviously, like, yes, paying attention to how you feel specifically when you eat a certain food. I mean, I think that having a baseline and a foundation of, yes, we should all be eating food that spoils. I think that's sort of a number one thing. Like, let's not even consider any of these other food sources. But then after that's the case, let's start to think about and not just blanket statements say everybody should be eating X, Y, and Z food, but more so think about, yes, we have different genetic backgrounds, different metabolism, different environments, et cetera, different health histories, and so different gut microbiomes. Like, we have very different approaches and very different results from eating, the same foods. And I think that a lot of people aren't talking about this at all.
Yeah, it's the quality over quantity, approach. And I think it's a pretty informative way to look at food, because the truth is, I mean, nutrition is way more complex than pharmacology. Pharmacology is often one molecule, and you're trying to look at some specific effects and trying to set up a trial and get some outcomes. Nutrition, you can't do that. You have to use much more of your scientific repertoire. You actually have to look at anecdotes. You have to use some common sense. You have to look at historical data. Like, you can't be an expert in nutrition and know nothing about evolutionary biology.
Right.
It's not possible. And it's a field that requires really, really broad expertise. And I think that's why it's so rare to get all of that in one person. And when you go to these conferences like the one I'm going to in Low Carb Denver, you're just like, wow. So medicine really can be forward looking, but it's just not mainstream yet.
Right. I mean, as far as your insulin score versus your keto score, how do those two things differ, I guess, in the back end?
Yeah. So we use the insulin score actually to calculate our keto score, because as people might know, when insulin is high in the blood, your ketone production goes down. So your liver produces the vast majority of the ketones in your body. And it can only do that if insulin is sufficiently low. Basically, insulin is permissive of ketone production. So it's sort of the reciprocal with some tweaks and adjustments of the insulin score. And that's how we can help people choose foods that are ketogenic. And if people look at the labels we use, we have a label called moderate, because we had to figure out a way to answer the protein question with ketones. I'm sure you've got that question about 200 million times from friends and family and whatnot about, how do I keep my ketones high? Do I have to restrict protein a lot? And basically our keto score tries to take that science into account and makes sure that people aren't scared away from protein rich and nutrient dense foods because of their ketone production. So we try to adjust for that as best we can.
And then as far as the nutrient density score you guys have, what is sort of the thought process behind that?
So the nutrient density score is really the most interesting score we have. And it's my personal favorite, because first of all, it's way, way, way harder to build than the insulin score or the keto score, for which you can get decent data. Nutrient density score is a mess, because you've got a ton of different micronutrients. You've got some very contradictory views on which nutrients are essential, how much you need. The government recommendations we get telling us how much we need, they're really inaccurate. So to build a nutrient density score was sort of a massive undertaking for us. It took our machine learning expert, our CTO, and myself mainly to try to come up with something that that was actually going to be representative of a score that could predict if you're getting some proper nutrition. So the principles we center around are understanding that you have to make the right comparison. So if I'm trying to tell you what's nutrient dense and I'm comparing two foods, I can either do it per weight or per calories. And that's sort of going to change. It's going to favor plants or it's going to favor animal foods. It's going to give you crazy results like spices being the most nutrient dense food ever. And if you have some few spices, your nutrient density score is like perfect. But we know that's unrealistic because nobody eats spices in hundreds of grams or something. So a lot of the typical nutrient density scores you get are sort of wacky because they're not really actually tailored to reality in that sense.
Right.
So we try to do all of these adjustments and, take into account that, eggs have way better protein availability than, for example, cereal grains. So that's what our score is trying to do. It's trying to bring some very basic science to some scores that historically have been pretty terrible, honestly. People can't really use them to know if they're getting sufficient nutrient intakes. And we do something very simple. We show you your micronutrient intake and the micronutrients in which you're lowest, we give you a recommended best source. And this is a list that we've basically curated, trying to identify the sources that are going to help you sort of plug those nutritional gaps that absolutely everyone has, by the way. No one gets a perfect score. First of all, because we don't know what the exact target is. And second of all, because our food is very different from how it was historically and, all sorts of complicated things. But basically, we try to give a general score of how nutrient dense your diet was. And so it's to be used in conjunction with the other scores to make sure you're taking care of your metabolism and as well as your nutrition.
Got it. So, the nutrient density is not, so it balances out when you start adding things to your plate on your app, not necessarily like, getting sort of overloaded in certain nutrients. And if you're just eating 10 out of 10 nutrient density, then, I could see that if you're just eating the same food over and over and over again, then you might maybe have some gaps in your nutrition, which you guys address with some recommendations.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we're actually learning from our users here because we didn't, there's no way for us to really know. We can sort of track our food and play around with the score and see what our score tells us is a really nutrient-dense diet. But there are many ways to get there, actually, because there are so many foods. We have more than 20,000 foods in our database, and they have more than 37 nutrient coverage. So it's a pretty deep coverage for a decently broad database. So there are so many combinations of foods that you can use to get a high score. So we're really interested to see how you can get a high nutrient, sort of a nutrient completeness score, actually, is what we call the general score for the day, and nutrient density we use for individual foods. And we're sort of learning that, there are different ways to get nutrient-dense diet, which I guess we're relearning something that we might already have known. But it's interesting to see how different people get there and how it correlates with, the other goals that they're trying to follow. And I guess at the moment we're seeing that, if you don't keep your protein too low, that's a really, really good thing for a sort of nutrient-complete diet.
So keeping your protein at a level that is high, you're saying is high nutrient density?
Yeah, if you can adjust your protein up and down. So some people, if they're aiming for a certain degree of ketosis, they might need to moderate their protein slightly if they're trying to go pretty deeply ketogenic, and they might be one of those people who are very sensitive to protein and sort of don't produce a ton of ketones. So in those people, they might need to adjust it down, but not so far down where they're going to lose out on nutrient density. And I think that's the interesting thing, because I've been tracking my own diet, obviously, with the app. And, I can see that I can be between anywhere from 75 to 82% fat, so pretty high ketogenic, and still get a nutrient density score from between 6 to 9 out of 10. So really, it's really a question of choice and sort of which foods you're including. But that's why the score is there, to let people have that free choice.
Yeah. So are your nutrient recommendations and the way you guys aggregate the score, is this changing due to considering that people are on different diets, like a ketogenic diet or carnivore or vegan diet?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something where we'd love to start working on more often. Because the truth is to do this in a way that's not sort of, oh, I have an idea and let's just assume it works. We actually need to compare it with some data. So if we wanted to, for example, see that, okay, people using our app and who are on a higher carb diet, how is their vitamin C intake compared to people on a ketogenic or carnivore diet? Right. So we can compare that, and then we could look at their keto score and see, okay, does the level of ketosis predict their vitamin C intake, and might we have reason to think it affects their need? So we'd love to keep working on those things, but unfortunately, a lot of them aren't yet factored into the score because it's really, really difficult to do. But we've got some things that are sort of unique to us where we think, and actually I learned this from Chris Masterjohn, and I think, credit where credit is due. The essential fatty acids that we use are different from what the government recommends. So we think that the essential fatty acids aren't ALA and LA. It's the omega-3 and the omega-6 fat. We think it's another omega-3 fat called DHA, EPA, and the other omega-6 fat, arachidonic acid. So we choose different ones because we think the evidence is much stronger for those, and we wouldn't want to mislead people into targeting some fatty acids that are not necessarily essential for their health.
Got it. Makes sense. So what are some of the most nutrient dense foods that you guys, like, are there any 10 out of 10s? Where do you guys see sort of the highest nutrient density?
So you've got a lot of the animal foods are generally the most nutrient dense. So I think lamb liver is probably 9 or 10. So organ meats tend to be really, really nutrient dense. Shellfish tend to be super, super nutrient dense. I think crab is 10 out of 10, bluefin crab. So, it depends really what you like. I think there's a lot of choice. You can get a lot of tasty foods that are super nutrient dense, so people shouldn't worry. I guess if you could order that on Amazon Fresh, that would be even better. So we're working on that, but for the moment, you'll just have to look through the search and go shop for it.
Right. So, I mean, as far as how you eat then and how you've sort of gone through this stuff, it sounds like you're in sort of a more of a carnivore-ish approach. What's your sort of slant and how you're getting out of your nutrition?
So I started out basically my plate as soon as I finished reading Gary Taubes' book and started implementing all of this. My plate was, I would say, 3/4 of vegetables and some nuts drenched in a lot of olive oil, and with some fish or some eggs and some meat, but probably about half of what I'm eating now in terms of meat and fish. And then progressively, I just started noticing that some of the plants I wasn't digesting properly. I just couldn't handle them. So slowly, I just took that away. Oh, and I forgot to mention quite a lot of dairy, since I am from France after all, so I kind of owe that. And then progressively just started taking away the plants and the fruit and the nuts, and slowly have ended up on a carnivore diet and eating much more meat, fish, eggs, dairy, all of that stuff, because that's where I feel less bloated. I don't have, as much diarrhea as I would have before. And, I have one autoimmune condition that I have since a kid, which is asthma, that I've managed to beat back basically after making some of these health changes. So I don't have any asthma at all. But when you have one autoimmune condition, you're much more likely to have a second. And it seems to be the case for myself that I have a digestive issue, probably of autoimmune origin. Something like ulcerative colitis. And I've noticed that, reducing my plant intake has really helped with the symptoms. And at the same time, it hasn't stopped me from eating a nutrient-dense diet as far as I can tell. And I can, do CrossFit. I can go for cold swims. I'm, full of energy. I can, work in the startup and my PhD and all of that. So I haven't had any performance decrements going carnivore, and I just seem to have improved my digestive symptoms, basically. So that's where I've traded off.
I mean, when looking at you guys' nutrient density chart and stuff like that, when you move to more of a carnivore approach, is there anything that you specifically noticed that you needed to shift as far as a certain incorporation of organ meats and different ones? Mm-hmm. Or like how have you looked at your nutrition there? How has it changed via you guys' approach to getting nutrient density keyed in?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because there's I would say the Sean Baker and the Paul Saladino camps of a nutrient-dense carnivore diets.
Uh-huh.
I just happen to love organ meats. Like, if it's sort of,
Well, you're from France again. Like
yeah,
it's
yeah, exactly.
normal. Yeah.
I'm such a cliche. It's terrible. But
Great.
anything from like tripe to liver to kidneys to brain, I love it. I mean, one of my favorite meals is a brain omelet. So you have eggs, brain, and you just pan fry that, add some salt, maybe some pepper, and it's just delicious. It's really nutrient dense. It's simple. It's really quick. It's might as well be fast food. It's so fast to make. So for me, it's not even a question of is it nutrient dense for me. It's just I like to eat that way, and it makes people freak out, which is kind of fun.
How do you do that then when you're for instance traveling to Denver?
Yeah, so basically I went to the 7-Eleven, got some pork rinds, some beef jerky, and that's it. And just had that as my dinner because I was too far from the city center to walk there. So I just went to the 7-Eleven, and yeah, that worked fine for me.
So is that all you're going to eat for a couple of days, or how are you going to do?
No, that was just when I arrived, and it was pretty late. Otherwise, I'll just go to any. I could go to Wendy's and get just burger patties. I could go to a restaurant like I did this morning and get an omelet with sausages and bacon, and ask for extra butter, and I had a nice breakfast with coffee. It's honestly pretty easy. There's rarely a restaurant I go to where there's no option for me.
Got it. So you sort of work with your environment and whatever you're at.
Yeah.
And go around. Because like I've traveled with Paul, for example, and we were in Utah a couple of weeks ago for just a couple of days, and he had like 7 different organs shipped there, and we were eating them all raw. And I was sort of going along with it. But he prepares significantly in advance, and he takes all that stuff with him. So I didn't know.
I'm way too lazy for that.
I don't know if you were on that level or not. Yeah, and that's one of the comments I gave to him. I'm like, man, this is such a pain in the ass to have to like ship frozen food and then let it thaw. And then we were eating ribeyes and liver and pancreas and brain and kidney for breakfast.
Wow.
Egg yolks.
Wow.
Please
invite me to one of those breakfasts. I'll love that.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, and I feel fine too. But I've actually, after that weekend, it was a couple weeks ago, I've switched, and I'm just starting to. I want to learn more too, and I have a lot of ideas regarding nutrition and just sort of what's great. And I think that one of the things you said before is that a lot of people just generally they don't do well eating a standard American diet, and even if they switch to sort of like a paleo, moderate carb, it's like I don't think that you can get high carb diet eating real foods. Like I don't think it's almost impossible to get over like 100 grams of carbs if you're eating food that spoils. I'm not talking about rice or other things where you can get 150 grams in a day. And I think that what I'm starting to think about is we had availability to certain foods in our past, and there's probably some innate cycling that would be helpful, just like fasting. It's like, okay, we eat a lot and then we don't eat, so maybe what I'm thinking is like, maybe we eat some decent amount of carbs for a little bit and then we stop eating some carbs. So actually another thing that Paul was eating there was honey. And so obviously because it comes from an animal source. And so I'm actually on an experiment currently of trying to eat higher carbohydrates, lower fat, just to see how I feel. And again, I don't think that's probably a good idea for most people who have any sort of health conditions, who have overeaten carbohydrates their whole life. But people like I've been sort of extreme ketosis for the last 3-4 years. And I just want to see how I feel and how things are going and my body comp, my energy levels, all this other stuff. Because I think that when we talk about carbs in this space, I think they get unfairly demonized. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that. I mean, you can incorporate this stuff, and I think that humans in general should be able to. It doesn't mean that you have to. I think that we're omnivores and can sort of dabble in both animal and plant products. But I think that we're going so far one end where I think a lot of people are just sort of focused on you have to only eat keto or else you're not going to be a healthy person. And so I'm experimenting myself currently, and man, I have to say, like it's actually pretty challenging to eat enough carbohydrates to like get enough energy at this point in real foods.
That's super interesting. I'd love to see look at your CGM data and your dietary insulin load.
Yeah,
that would be really interesting.
So I am using a CGM to sort of determine which foods and what amounts do spike my blood sugar reasonably or not. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, sort of the carb sources that I'm looking at are, some fermented dairy, berries, like kiwis. I've noticed the most nutrient dense fruit, so I'm incorporating some of that, and then sweet potatoes, plantains, cassava, like some of these like root vegetables that are they're starches. And so I'm just like, it's a pain in the ass to cook all this stuff. I have to say, it's a way easier. It's like ketogenic diet is far easier as far as if you're optimizing for convenience. There's no doubt about that. And so I'm like having to cook multiple potatoes at a time, and it's just a pain in the ass. But even if I do that, I'm at like 75 to 100 grams of carbs a day, and I can't eat anymore. And I've noticed that having to get all this bulk of carbohydrate in is actually pushing my protein lower than what I would have normally eaten on a sort of a carnivore-ish approach like I was doing before.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So two things come to mind. Are you having your carbs after the meat and fibrous veggies?
They're all together. It's like a normal meal.
All together.
Yeah.
Okay, because it probably doesn't matter for you. I'm guessing you're pretty insulin sensitive, but some people will notice that if they have the starchier, more sugary stuff, it's better to have it at the end of the meal, because a lot of it's basically the meat and the fiber slows gastric emptying, and that changes the incretins, these molecules in your these cells in your gut, which sort of signals how much insulin you need to produce. So having those at the end, sort of at the tail end of the meal, for some people can be important. So yeah, it's fun to, I think, experiment with how many carbs you can have, and play around with how you can keep that blood sugar low for a given level of carbs, because when you have them and in which form you have them matters a lot to how you spike your blood sugar. And yeah, so I'll be really interested if you do a podcast on that experiment after.
Yeah. So I took tons of lab work recently.
Amazing.
And so I'm gonna probably do this for like 6 weeks and then see. So far, I actually feel way better in my energy levels than I was before. So over the last couple of months, I've sort of been a little lethargic, and I'm like, man, like what is going on? Because I've been eating sort of carnivore-ish, and yeah, I mean, since I popped in the carbs, I've actually felt pretty awesome. So which sort of goes against what I think a lot of people would recommend. But I've also been super fat adapted in keto for, I don't know how many years at this point. And so like, I don't remember the last time I consistently have eaten over 75 grams of carbs for more than a couple days, probably 5 years ago.
Wow.
And this is something where I don't know if that's a normal representation of human biology and inputs. Like, would we have really, throughout our human history, have gone that long? I don't know. And I mean, these are some of the open-ended questions that we have that we don't really have answered as, not necessarily as keto safe long-term. I think it's perfectly fine, but is it optimal? Like what's going to happen when I eat a lot of carbs? I'm going to do the same thing with carnivore. And I want to use myself as sort of a guinea pig whenever possible, just to learn more what works for me. And so that's sort of,
that's awesome. And I would encourage, the low carb keto carnivore crowd to pay particularly close attention to your anecdote and those kinds of anecdotes that actually contradict what some might have predicted. I think that's where we're actually going to learn the most, or even understanding why some people can get away with higher carb diets. Thanks to my friend Gabor Erdosi, who's the adipocyte Jedi, as I call him. Basically, he's the master of everything adipose tissue and metabolism. And with him, I've learned a lot. And one of the things is that the where you get your carbs from, and the timing and the food order and the state of your gut, these things really, really matter to the response you can get. And so maybe it shouldn't surprise us that much that you actually got some benefit from that. I don't know. It's still an open-ended question for me, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see your lab work.
My sleep score, I mean, as far as my Oura ring also has been improved. My sleep quality has been improved. So these are just some things like, who knows? Like maybe what works for me long-term is like a week of having carbs and then 4 months of not eating them. I don't know. But I think I always want to like play with it a little bit and see what happens. So I'll keep you posted as far as what I find.
Cool.
But yeah, man, why don't you give people a little bit of background and where they can find more about your work, especially the app?
Yeah, so the website is nutrita.app. That's nutrita.app. And there you can go to just basically sign up to the app and, choose a goal and sign up and just, check it out. Or you can just go to nutrita.app/blog, and that's where all our content is. And we have, articles ranging from insulin sensitivity to nutrient-dense diets to the effects of keto, on stress hormones, and everything in between. So I'm on Twitter at Raphael S7. And that's pretty much it. We have a Facebook group, Nutrita Community, where people share their progress and troubleshoot, and post pictures of their workouts and stuff. And that's it.
All right, man. Thanks for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research in books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing, and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.